at your church how you were sort of labeled divisive and a heretic. And for someone who's spent their life trying to bridge build, um, and talking about equity and all this stuff, that has to be the most difficult thing to wrestle with when you're in a community that you're a part of, that it's a community, you're
Yeah.
together, and then
Yeah.
all of a sudden you're divisive because you're bringing up something that's needing to be talked about. How What was that like for you? And I know that your husband was on staff at the church.
He was on staff for 10 years, 25 years ago. And then we were
Okay.
elders at that point. We were elders. So he was still like on staff in a lot of ways. He was the head elder at the
Wow.
time. So even though he was a full time high school teacher, head football coach, he also was investing time as the head elder of the
Yeah.
church when this all happened. So, man, that's such a tough question to answer because it is, it's incredibly painful because we had invested 25 years in this
Mm.
community. We moved to Washington State for this community. This was a community that my husband had grown up in. He grew up at the church. So the senior pastor who called him out to Washington State 25 years ago had been his senior pastor as a little boy. And then the church split while he was away at college. And then they wanted a Black youth pastor. They felt like they heard from God. We need to have a Black youth pastor. And this pastor happened to run into my husband's mom, and she said, "Oh, did you know he's in college to be a youth pastor?" And that's just kind of how we ended up out here 25 years ago in a predominantly white church.
Mm.
That they knew like if you're going to draw people of color, you need somebody of color in your leadership team.
Yeah.
And so, I also wrestled with like hearing from God because I don't know so much that it was hearing from God, we need a Black youth pastor, or it was conveniently like we need a Black person on staff to, anyway. So I wrestled with that
Like, so
often.
the motivation to be diverse. So
Yes.
like you couldn't tell whether or not it was sort of what the motivation was for them wanting to have a Black youth pastor.
Well, looking back,
Yeah.
I'll say that in retrospect, like
Yeah.
at the time, that felt really exciting, and and we served on leadership at church for 10 years, and then we adopted a little girl out of a gang here in Tacoma,
Mm.
and we felt like God was saying, "You got to rescue her out of." So we left the area and moved to the other side of the state to
Mm.
give her a fresh start. Um,
Love it.
and then I ended up winning Teacher of the Year on that side of the state and was asked to come back and work for our state superintendent back on the other. So we did this like move back and forth.
Yeah.
But we continued to go to the church once we came back to the west side because the state capital doesn't have a lot of churches that are very diverse. And I should say that because my husband and I were on staff, the church did become diverse. So it went from being 98% white to probably 65 to 70% white.
Okay.
So I
Wow.
mean the desired demographics were accomplished. Here's what I'll say though,
Yeah.
right now, because I'll forget if I don't say it now. There is racially diverse and there's culturally diverse.
Yes.
And what I will say is this church was racially slash ethnically diverse, but not culturally diverse.
Yeah.
There was an expectation of assimilation.
Yeah. For sure. I get that.
And that also, I sit in a really unique place because I am a Black woman adopted by white people. So I know how to do white culture really well. I'm very fluent in middle class white America.
Mm.
And so I can show up in leadership spaces and be articulate, and I can quote scripture, and I know how to be in the presence of large rooms of white men too. And part of that is playing basketball with white men for so
Yeah.
long.
Yeah.
There is no white man that intimidates me. My dad is a 78-year-old white man, so I am like fluent. I'm skilled in being around white men.
Yeah.
So what is interesting
Mm.
is the ways that my husband, not as much. So he was raised not in the same space that I was. And even though he'd grown up at this church as a little guy, my husband is much more culturally urban and Black than I am. And so and he's also a large Black ex football player. There
Mm.
are ways that he is unwilling to assimilate.
Yeah.
that caused him a lot of problems at the
Mm.
church because he is louder. He's 6'2", 350. He's a loud person. He's got a big chest cavity. He's a loud human, but he also grew up in a space where loud is just part of what his brother's a news reporter.
Mm.
Like they talk for a living, they talk
Yeah.
loudly for a living. This is what they do. And there was often times looking back now where he was asked to be quiet, but we were both
Wow.
asked to be small. And neither one
Yes.
of us is
Oh.
small, but we were
Oh.
both asked, as long as you show up this way. So just give you an example. Um, I don't want to spill too much tea, but I tried out for the WNBA at 28 years old.
Mm.
We had 3 little kids at home. My husband at the time was a youth pastor. I was not working full time. I was a stay-at-home mom.
Mm.
But his mother came to live with us. So mom-in-law lived with us. She worked part-time and then she was home with the kids. So we were both home with the kids when I got the opportunity to try out.
Mm.
And people were not happy that I was trying out. Like, how dare you, when your husband is the youth pastor, how dare you take time away from your children to try out for the WNBA? In
Right.
fact, even
Right.
before I got the tryout for the WNBA, I would play basketball 3 or 4 times a week because it was my love. Like playing ball was so much a part of who I am, and it was a release for me. And so as a mom, I would bring my kids. The gym had a really great childcare program, and I'd play ball 4 times a week. And there were a lot of people at my church that really had concern about that.
Wow.
How dare you leave your children in a childcare for an hour? I'd play basketball 4 hours a week, 4 times a week for an hour. And there were some people that had a hard time with that, who wanted me to be a certain kind of pastor's wife. And even though I know how to do middle class white America, I was also not raised in a Pentecostal evangelical church.
Mm.
My parents are both more traditional, like Lutheran Presbyterian.
Like
So I
mainline.
was not, yes,
Yeah.
mainline. So
Yeah.
I was raised in Europe in a mainline denomination where the expectations for pastors' wives are not the same at all as the
Mm.
white evangelical church.
Yeah.
So I didn't, even though I know middle class white America, I didn't know white evangelical culture.
Yes. Yes. Right. And if you
And
did, if you did though, would you have changed anything?
well, here's the thing. I
Yeah.
think there was a season for me where I tried to. I really did
Yeah.
because I felt pressure to be the good pastor's wife.
Yeah.
Right? Like when I was in my 20s and early 30s, I felt pressure. I'll be real looking back at it now. I felt pressure like maybe the godly thing for me to do is to be this good pastor's wife.
Yeah.
And maybe the godly thing is to not play so much basketball. Even when I decided to go back into teaching in the public school, there was some mess that people like, why am I working? Why am I not teaching in a private school? Why am I not homeschooling my kids? I mean, there was
Whoa.
that stuff too. So, like, all of this is setting the stage for what happened in the last few years.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Right. That like what it sounds like to me is that there was no surprise there from my perspective because I grew up in that. There's no surprise that when everything went down and it really was with Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, but like the world exploded with George Floyd. And to see like the way the white evangelical church reacted to that was very different than they did earlier on. It was just much more powerful. So from my perspective, I could see that tide coming for someone that grew up mainline in Europe.
I I had no idea. And in
Yeah.
fact, I mean, let's back up a little bit too from the last couple years. I ran for a statewide office in 2016.
Mm.
Had I known, had I known the whole dynamic around Trump and Clinton, I mean, maybe we would have not chosen to run that year.
Yeah.
But I ran to lead public schools. So in the state of Washington, the state superintendent is an elected position.
Wow.
It is one of the executive offices. And I had worked as the assistant state superintendent for 4 years. I
Wow.
was asked by people to run. In fact, people wrote my name in the prior election, even when I was not running. But I felt like it was a time to run. And I have never wanted to be a politician, but I absolutely have wanted to have a voice in education,
Mm.
particularly because I love public education. I love teaching as a profession. I don't love the system, but
Yeah.
I love teaching as a profession. Absolutely love teaching as a profession.
Mm.
I think there's incredible, well, I grew up in a country where we see teachers as like the highest of professions or
Wow.
professionals. America doesn't, but I
Yeah.
really ran because I wanted to project this image of teaching as an incredible profession, of the importance of education, that education should be paramount. We should be
Mm.
thinking about how we're investing in public schools in ways that Americans just are not. And so I ran not because I wanted to be a politician, but
Yeah.
because I wanted to use the position as a bully pulpit to talk about education and what we should be doing, I think, to make education better. Well, what was interesting is the bill, or the role is billed as nonpartisan. So I thought, well, perfect. I'm nonpartisan. I'm the perfect
Yeah.
nonpartisan person.
Yeah.
But the reality is you can't win nonpartisan.
No. No.
And I learned that really quickly. And of
That,
course, I'd
yeah.
not really been involved in politics. So I'm running
Yeah.
cold. Like, I don't know anything
Uh,
about anything. And I am told, well, you probably need to get a campaign manager. I go to 3 different campaign managers, and all of them say to me, "You're too young." So I was 45 at the time, but I don't look my age. So they said, "You're too young. You need to run for school board." I was like, "I was the assistant state superintendent. What do you mean I have to run for school board?" Um, so all 3 potential companies that I was going to pay to support me. All 3 made it really clear they didn't believe in me. So why am I going
wow.
to pay people that don't believe in me? So now I have to start running my campaign on my own. I don't know how to run a campaign. You will not support me, people up in Seattle who folks pay.
Right.
And so I found a team. We created a cabinet of amazing people.
Mm.
And I knew I had to run as a Democrat. But I didn't, because again, I did not grow up in the evangelical church. So I did not know what was about to come. What I did, my gut told me, go meet with the chair of the Republican Party, because I knew she'd been a Young Life person, and my husband and I had worked in Young Life before. And
Mm.
so I went and met with the chair of the Republican Party for our state. I said, I cannot run as a Republican because, as a Black woman who does work with English language learners and immigrants in the state of Washington, your rhetoric at the national level is so gross
Yeah.
that I can't run as a
That's good.
Republican.
That's good.
But I need you to understand where I'm coming from. I'm a Jesus girl. I've been serving in church for the last 20 years. So I just was really transparent with the chair of the Republican Party. But I said, I can't run. And she said, you know what? I get it. And I'm going to support you. The chair of the Republican Party said,
Whoa.
I'm going to support you. I was like, okay.
Wow.
So then I declare as a Democrat. And I'm not a big D Democrat. I've never been political. But the values of the Democratic Party around education, I absolutely supported. And so I decided to run as a Democrat.
Wow.
Um, People at my church lost their ever loving minds, some
I'm
of
sure
them.
that
Not everybody,
I'm sure they
not
did.
everybody,
Yeah.
but some of them lost their ever loving minds.
Yeah.
And we'd be in church, and somebody would walk up to me in the middle of like worship and say things like, I can't believe you're running as a baby killer. Like, I'm running to
Whoa.
lead public schools. I am running to lead public schools. I'm not, anyway, I'm not running to be
Wow.
governor. I'm not running to be mayor. And so these were the little comments that I started to get before service, after service. There were other people that I'm just running. They didn't really care which party I was running for, which was fine.
Hmm.
But that was my window into white evangelicals in the Republican Party. I had no context to know that because I didn't grow up in America. I didn't grow up in the white evangelical church. And I had no idea that good Christians are supposed to be Republican.
That's no question. Yeah.
Right. Which
Yeah.
I know now. I know
Yeah.
this now, but I had no idea. And
Oh,
now I am running for office while watching conservative Christian folks and how they're showing up to Trump.
absolutely. That was the thing that swung the election for him. When he went to Liberty and quoted 2 Corinthians, he got all the evangelicals in. He got all of them.
It was so gross for me to watch.
Yeah,
It was
I'm sure.
I mean, and I remember on the day of the election, November 2nd, I remember the day of the election so clearly. And I ended up losing my election by 1 percentage point, less than one,
Oh,
actually.
without a
Yeah. So
campaign
we're,
manager. That's
well,
impressive.
well, so I ended up getting a campaign manager because one of the city council people for Seattle had met me and was so impressed with who I was that he made his campaign manager support me. He made him take me on.
That's
But
interesting.
here's what I'll tell you though, that person had a conflict of interest that he didn't share with me when I signed him and paid him. So anyway, that's a story for
Oh
a whole
man.
nother podcast. But
Yeah, yeah.
um, I did have a campaign manager, but I will say he was not 100% on Erin
Oh, oh,
Jones'
brutal.
campaign.
Brutal.
It was really brutal, and that God taught me so many. So I don't regret any minute of it. So much that I learned, so incredibly painful. I will never run again. I don't regret it though, because I became stronger because of it. And
Yeah.
what I believe as a person of faith is God was preparing me for this moment.
Hmm.
I absolutely see that today.
Hmm.
At the time, though, the most painful thing I've ever experienced. But I can remember on November 2nd, during the election, as numbers are coming in, and my husband has a master's degree in political science. So he had already said Trump was going to win. He'd already said that weeks
Yeah.
earlier. And I was like,
Yeah.
heck no. There is no way that that silly man is going to win. There's just no way.
Right.
And I remember we're in a hotel room because all the Democratic Party, they have a convention room at a big hotel, and then people have their own, different people running campaigns have their own rooms and they're celebrating. And I'm watching my numbers come in, and I know that at this point it's so close, but he's still ahead of me. And we go up to my room with my campaign team, and we're looking at Trump's numbers, and
Hmm.
I'm crying now. And it's not about
Hmm.
my election. I am watching Trump win, and I know we are
Wow.
headed into a season. And I'm not even worried about my numbers at this point.
Wow.
I know the writing is on the wall because I've been watching. What, running a statewide campaign, you get to hear it all. You get to hear all of the big dogs talking. And I was in spaces with the Republican folks running statewide and getting to listen to them,
Hmm.
and just watching members of my own community say things. And it just, I cried that day, not because I loved Hillary Clinton so much, because I
Right.
didn't.
Right. Right.
So I'm not anti-Republican,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that he was now going to be the face, and that so many people that identified as Christian were, I just like, it just made no sense to me.
Yeah. Right. The same that this is like, so 2016 for you. Wow, that's huge. What a night to have to be waiting for your own results alongside of this major, what in the world? How is this guy, the celebrity apprentice, our president, right?
Yeah.
What a night. And like the shock of that was sort of mitigated by the fact that you'd been running for office, you'd seen it all. So when, fast forward 2 3 years, you were still attending that church after all this, right? And still
Yeah. So
actively involved.
yeah, so here's what happened. I remember, so my race, they literally were counting ballots until 3 weeks later. That's how close the race was, that they had to count
Wow.
ballots. I did not know until 3 weeks after the election who actually had won. And I actually conceded before they counted the last votes, but it was narrowing, narrowing, narrowing. So less than 1% I lost by
Wow.
27,000 votes.
Oh,
Yeah, I mean, really like minimal numbers. But
yeah.
now I'm so thankful now, because I'd be have run schools in a pandemic, which would not have been fun. But
No.
I know God was looking out for me. But anyway, I can remember this, the week that I conceded. I did so on Facebook. I went Facebook Live and I said, "Hey Chris, it's yours. Great
Hmm.
race. Thank you, fellow Democrat. We
Mm.
actually live in the same region.
Nice.
Um, blessings. What have a great ride."
Yeah.
That next Sunday, my pastor preached a message. And one of the things he said is, there's some of you have been out of ministry for a little while, and it's a season to come back. And I felt really compelled that even though my husband was no longer the youth pastor, they had just lost their youth pastor for a number of reasons. And there was a guy that was like the interim youth pastor. And I felt like, you know what, right now I need kid stuff to focus
Mm.
on, because I ran to support kids.
Yeah.
How about I come back and just volunteer in youth ministry?
Nice.
And so I did. So I went to pastor afterwards and said, I feel like that message is for me. I
Mm.
really do need to. I ran to invest in kids. Now that I haven't been chosen, I believe I'm supposed to. So I started going back to youth group. Now, what's important is we live in the state capital. The church is in Tacoma, which is a 45-minute drive
Oh,
without
wow.
traffic. So
Wow.
I am now committing to at least once a week driving 45 minutes
Yeah. Wow.
to volunteer as as a 45-year-old woman, when everyone else in the ministry is 30 or under. So I am literally the oldest person there, and but I love it, and
Mm.
I love volunteering. But I also knew that day I am watching the dynamics of race play out in Trump's election, and I'm watching the dynamics of race play out across our country. And I went to our pastor a couple weeks later and said, "Hey, I do this race work for a living. I talk about race and reconciliation for a living. I just want to offer that for free. I would love to provide some training for the staff and the elders." At the time, my husband was not an elder.
Mm.
Um, he was not on staff, but I said I would absolutely be willing to do training for the church.
That's
He
awesome.
said,
Yeah.
"No, we don't need it. No, we
Whoa.
don't need it." And I remember at that moment,
Whew.
like something in the pit of my stomach was like, okay, this is not, because I'm seeing how we need it. And in fact, I am hearing from former youth kids of mine who are now adults in Bible studies that, so Black and brown young people who are now in their 20s in Bible studies that are mostly white people, who were told how to vote, and that
Yeah.
if they
Right.
didn't vote for Trump. So I'm already hearing some dynamics around race from some of the young people that we had raised up. And so I know we need the work. And when he said we don't need it, that was my original sense of, this is 2017 now.
Mm.
Okay, there's a problem. 6 months later, he comes back to me and says, "I apologize. I knew at the time we needed the work, but I was too scared to embrace it because I was worried that it could cause more problems." So he said, "You can come do a training." So I did a
Yeah.
training,
Oof.
didn't hear anything back. Didn't hear anything back. Not a thing. And so years go by. Years go by, and then the pandemic hits.
So can I ask a question about that?
Yeah, yeah.
You did, first of all, it's amazing to me. I'm so curious after he first said no, we don't need it. Like you kept at it. Like that's, that could be like a shutdown. You're not valuable here. And what you bring, and you, not just your expertise, but and you're noticing as a person of color that we have an issue here, and I'm telling you it's not an issue. That's a big deal. You're saying with the training, people didn't say anything in response to it? Like you didn't get any kind of feedback about it, or what was that like?
I mean, people seem to really enjoy the training, because the way I tell people, and if you're just listening, you can't see this, but I tell people I come to the training not like this, not like an
Yeah.
aggressor.
Yeah.
I come like this.
Yeah.
I come inviting people.
Yeah.
And so just the way that I do training is very invitational. Like,
Yeah.
it's going to be a little bit uncomfortable because
Of
talking
course.
about race is uncomfortable, but I don't come confrontational to training. That's not how I do this work. I come
Hmm.
with love, and love means calling stuff out sometimes.
Yes.
But it's not about like, oh, you white people are bad and you're racist. That's not how I do it. I've never done training that way. It's not effective. Like, it'd be like telling
Right.
12-year-olds, "You all suck and you're dumb." That would not work, right?
Well,
Like,
it is true. This is the ever present problem that, and I get why, like, there's such a major backlash against woke culture. I get it,
yeah,
because I used to be on these Zoom calls and stuff, and I used, like, I think they're like woke Olympics, where one person's
yeah,
trying to out woke the other person,
yes, yes,
and
yes.
it's all while people that don't necessarily know the language, are new to the conversation, are immediately excluded and have no chance of being brought along. Which, what did they, with our culture, what option do they then have? They go to the nationalistic, like Trump camp kind of stuff. They're like, yeah, I'm in there, I feel completely isolated, and people are trying to tell me that I need to think a certain, it is just not helpful.
Nope.
So
Nope, it's not. And I knew that going into it. So I think people really enjoyed the first training.
Yeah.
Here's what I think happened though. Like I heard nothing about it after that day. Here's what I think happened. Other stuff was more important though.
Yes.
Right. And so how often, and you know this from school spaces too, like we got other priorities though. So, this talk about race it's just not the most important thing right now.
Right.
We got other stuff that we got to invest our time in,
Uh,
blah, yada, yada, yada.
uh, it's
I
second.
know. I know.
It's and the issue. Did you ever hear someone say it's not a gospel issue?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Just preach the Bible.
Right. Right.
Just talk about the Bible.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which,
Yeah.
I mean, the Bible is all about how we engage one another,
Oh my goodness. I just
right?
can't.
It's
I
all
can't.
how do we love each other? How do
Yeah.
we love each other? And to assume that like love looks the same and we communicate it the same way is just, and this is where like I absolutely believe God allowed me to live overseas, to travel to
Mm,
16 countries, to speak 4 languages, to understand there is not one way to do
yeah.
anything, right?
Beautiful.
and
Yeah.
and to assume that there's one way that is right and just read the Bible, Aaron, just preach
Mm,
the Bible, is just so limiting because it doesn't recognize and honor the many ways that God made us. He made
yeah.
us with different languages and different cultures and different places and different experiences. And so,
Yes.
anyway,
And what a unique experience though that you have that you bring to the table that is kind of like, okay, we're good. Because when someone says preach the Bible, they're talking about a very myopic expression of the Bible.
yes,
They don't really want you to preach the Bible because that
right.
actually
No,
could mean that could mean a lot of
no,
things.
no. Yeah. Uh huh. Uh huh. I just heard somebody else on TikTok, and I can't remember who it was, talk about in the Spanish version of the Bible, like justice means something very different than in Americans' interpretation and white America's interpretation of justice.
Mm,
And I thought it's almost made me like I'm reading through the Bible right now in English, but I think I'm going to go through next and listen to it again in Spanish because I speak Spanish.
wow. You speak
Um,
four languages, right?
yeah, English,
Yeah.
Dutch, French, and Spanish.
Mm,
But because of that, like I understand that a word is not a word is not a word,
no, right.
right?
Exactly.
Like it's and there are certain things that cannot be communicated in the English language because we don't have words for that thing,
Absolutely.
or how we interpret it in the United States is not that same word
Yeah.
in England is interpreted differently. That same word in South Africa is interpreted differently.
Yeah, this is the perfect example of this is love, right? You'll often hear, I mean, there's what, five, how many Greek words? Now, man, I've been out of seminary a long time.
I think there's 8 now. There's
Yeah.
8 and there are 4 that are primary, but I think that
Yeah.
we just talked about this yesterday in the gathering.
Right. So we've got this, and often, so as a result, you'll hear people accurately say like is more. They're not saying they want to say love is more than just this, but they'll say love
Yeah.
is not this. It's action. Love is all these different ways that we express it. It's just you change one word, you change everything about the whole story. So that's really unique to be able to
Yeah.
speak all those languages and understand how different cultures or contexts might understand a particular passage. That's really, really
You know, it's
fascinating.
it's one thing you'll understand this as an educator too, that it's one reason that when I train teachers, I tell them do not ever put on your wall respect as an expectation,
Oh, so good.
because respect is not one thing,
Right.
and respect is absolutely cultural. And so respect in Japan is you look at the feet of the person disciplining you.
Mm,
In the United States, in white America, it's look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you.
yes.
So if you are disciplining a Japanese child and they are looking at your feet and you say, look me in the eyes when I'm talking to you, what you are asking them to do is be disrespectful.
Wow. Wow. That
But
is,
how often we don't talk about that though? We just say, well, I understand what respect is, and these kids should understand well, but you don't know the context they're coming from.
exactly right. Whew, that's a lot. Okay. Okay. I could go down that road for a while, but I want to hear more about your experience with this one. With like, so you're going through trying to participate in a community that actually seems to, from my perspective, and I wasn't there, continually tell you, we want you to be here, but be here the way we want you to be here.
Yes.
And it wasn't until things sort of got blew up for the whole country in terms of racial division, that something like really hit ahead for you in that community. Am I right?
Yes. So I when the pandemic hit on March 16th of 2020 is when school shut down, and
Mm.
in our state. And I lost all of my work in 24 hours. So
Wow.
I was a consultant full time. All of my consulting contracts were in schools, and within 24 hours I went from being really busy to zero work.
Wow.
And terrifying, terrifying. And I turned to my husband on March 12th, the evening of March 12th, and said to him,
My birthday,
"Honey,
by the
oh,
way. The big day.
it's a good day." My mom's is the 13th. I think we talked about
We
this
did,
before.
yeah,
Yeah, I think I remember that. But March 12th, I turned to my husband and said, "Honey, I'm not going to be bringing any money for the next month, 2 months." We thought the pandemic would last a month, six
Right,
weeks maybe.
right.
So
Yeah,
I thought I'll be back in June,
yeah.
and things just kept canceling on my calendar. And I turned to my husband and said, "I have nothing to offer our family." And I was the big money maker. I mean, he's an educator. He makes educator money, but I
Mm,
was making like administrator level money.
mm.
And I went to zero in 48 hours.
Wow,
And I'll never
wow,
forget what he said to me that night. He looked at me, and we've been married for 29 years now. So it's about
wow.
27 years at the time. And he said, "You know what, honey, you've been doing for a long time. I want to invite you to just be here for a little bit."
Mm,
And that was so beautiful. I mean, the pandemic was actually really good for us. We
mm.
struggled in our marriage in the like from 20 to 25, we struggled.
What?
Our
Yeah,
kids were all
yeah,
teenagers. It just was really hard.
yeah.
And I would also add that ministry was hard on our marriage too, because we
I'm
were,
sure.
now that I look back,
I'm
like
sure.
just navigating all of these things in ministry was really hard.
Yeah.
But we were in a place in our marriage that the pandemic was actually really good for us, and it
Nice.
caused us to be able to spend time together in ways that we hadn't for a long time. But
Mm, mm.
I ended up going online every day. I felt like God said in that resting moment, "Hey, Erin, what you do have in your hands." I remember God said on March 13th, I don't hear from God, but I felt this like in my inner being,
Yeah.
God saying to me, "What's in your hand?"
Mm.
And I said, "Well, what's in my hand is I have a computer and I have about 20,000 followers." And "Okay, what do you love, Erin?" "Well, I love teaching. I love
Yeah.
teaching." "Well, go Facebook Live." And I
Mm.
didn't even know how to do Facebook Live at the time, but I learned over the weekend. And
Yeah.
on March 16th, I started going Facebook Live every day. I did an hour every day for educators, an hour
Wow.
for middle and high school students, and then I read out loud every morning in English, Spanish, and French and Dutch every morning. And just
Wow.
trusted God. Like, I'm just going to put this out into the world. I'm not charging for it. This is just what I have to offer. This is the little bit that I have to offer.
Amazing.
And
Wow.
what was really amazing is, of course, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery are murdered.
Yep.
So while I'm online with people, these things are happening. And I happen to be a runner. So
Mm.
having Ahmaud Arbery be killed, he was the same age as my oldest son
Oh,
and running so it just for me was such a heavy moment in time. And I just remember being really feeling depressed in that season, and
mm.
nobody from church reached out to me. So I'm posting on Facebook
Wow.
about how sad I am in this moment and how awful this is, and nobody from our church reached out. But what happened is all the people who'd been following me on social reached out. So suddenly I had this other
Beautiful.
community of people that were
Beautiful.
reaching out and just loving on me. There were days where I would show up to class, and we transitioned from Facebook Live to Zoom. I would show up for class just so devastated by what was happening that somebody else would offer, "Erin, let us take over class today."
Yeah. Yeah.
And other people who I had not known until the pandemic started
Oh,
just would take over and love on me. And people sent me flowers, and this is in the middle of the shutdown. Like, Washington State shut down, so there was
mm-hmm.
no being out in places. But there'd be a knock at the door, and somebody had gone to a coffee shop and gotten my favorite coffee and left it outside my house.
Mm.
These are not people from my church. They're
No.
people from
Oh,
this new community
and that's
that
so,
God.
that's just so beautiful, because like it's painful at the same time, where you're not receiving from these people that you've been in connection with forever, And these new people, it's like this mixed bag, I'm sure. It must have been very
Yeah,
confusing. Yeah.
yeah. So and then of course George Floyd.
Yes.
And that was like, oh, actually, let me back up though, because I do want to give a shout out to a special person. I have a friend named Sherry
Mm.
who is white, and she grew up Seventh day Adventist, very, very involved, like was a teacher in the Seventh day Adventist schools, like trained Seventh day Adventist. And she's watching me walk through all of this.
Mm.
And we started when Ahmaud Arbery was murdered, they had the walk or run for Ahmaud on his birthday.
Yeah.
And she and I began running together every Sunday. She would run to me, I would run to her. And we would meet halfway between where we live. And every
Wow.
Sunday we would like have church
Oh,
in this train station, this Amtrak train station. We would just sit, we would run to each other about 2.5 miles. Each of us would run to the center point and sit and have church as white women and talk about race and justice.
ah, love it.
And that was so beautiful, just to
Yeah.
have another sister in Christ who was really, who cared about me in that way and was willing. She gave me so much hope that there are white people out there that want to have these, white Christian people who are willing to have these conversations. And
Yeah.
we ended up, really, for most of the pandemic, almost every Sunday we would either run or walk together.
Mm.
We actually called it bush church. So we would just walk
Love
on
that.
the trail in the woods and just talk about God and talk about our lives and pray for each other. And so all of that is happening
Ah,
as
that's
I'm
beautiful.
watching on social media.
Yeah.
People from my church community show up in ways in response to Black Lives Matter that are just gross.
Yeah.
I'm seeing stuff on Instagram and Twitter from people that I've known for 20, and I'm just like, who are you all?
Yeah.
Who
Right.
who have you become? Like, I don't even recognize. I had no idea that this is what you all thought.
Yes.
And it was super painful to watch that, as people who were not even Christians from my class are showing up to love me. I'm watching other people that are supposed to be my brothers and sisters say horrible things about Black people. Um, and then I decided, I think it was the first, at last week of June, I decided, you know what? There's this thing called the 21-day racial equity challenge that Michigan did,
Okay.
and they posted
Oh, yeah.
online. And
Yeah. 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 I've
yeah,
heard. Yeah.
it's really amazing. So
Yeah.
I said, what if I facilitated some 21-day racial equity challenges for people? So I started doing that with white leaders in our region on Zoom. So I
Awesome.
would go online once a week, and 2 hours I would just facilitate these conversations. And then I said to my husband, who at the time was the head elder of our church, honey,
Wow.
I think we should do this for our church elder board. I think we should do a version of it.
Yeah.
And so he called the pastor, and pastor said, oh yeah, we should do this. So we get on our first call. I think it must have been the first week in July. And Hubby's a teacher too, so like we know how to train people. And we're getting ready to do our first training. 60 people show up to the first Zoom
Mm.
event.
Mm.
60, man, it's a lot of people to talk about race. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we um we do introductions, and then this woman unmutes herself and she says, I can't believe the pastor and the church are letting you do this. This is demonic.
Oh,
This is demonic, and I can't believe you're being allowed to do this. And she disappears off Zoom.
demonic.
She unmutes herself, says that, disappears off Zoom. And do you know, nobody said anything.
Of course not. Of course not.
And you know what? James and I are badass teachers. And we just kept teaching. We just kept teaching. And we would do 6 hours of free training,
Love it. Love it.
and which
But
was
you
really
were,
beautiful.
it's beautiful. And at the same time, just so much must have been so painful because you are constantly getting this pushback from your church, constantly, and not getting supported. And yet you're still reaching out and offering and constantly hoping about,
Yes.
it's just, wow. That's a
It's
lot.
painful to see unbelievers really want to love people better, but then believers
I mean,
who,
that's my experience is that the people who have not been infected with white evangelicalism are far more are come to understanding justice and the way of Jesus even with like more easily. Um,
Yeah.
I think there's something about the way that people like myself, who if I were my teens, at that, I would have been right along. I would have been agreeing with all. I was a very conservative Republican up until I was 25. So
Yeah.
I would have been right there with people thinking that you were, starting trouble, that you were just some liberal,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's the
So
way we're
it's
trained to think.
one, it's about power, right? I mean, in the end,
Absolutely,
like
absolutely.
I absolutely know now what it's about. I've done enough reading and research and talking to people and for a season, and it's why I was so excited to hear your voice on TikTok,
Mm,
because for a season I felt so alone. I
mm,
felt like, and am I even a Jesus girl? Like, I know I love Jesus,
yeah.
and am I really a heretic? Like,
Yes.
maybe I am really a heretic.
You are actually, you are an evangelical heretic, which is the best of Christians. you know, one of the things you said made me gave me a lot of time to pause and think. Today, I was thinking about something you said on a TikTok uh, that I hadn't addressed in my life before. That I noticed, and you said it during this conversation about culture. There were plenty of black folks that were around my family. They all could assimilate well into white culture. So there was no kind of threat. But as I
Yep.
became a teenager, for the first time in my life, I went away to basketball camp in Pennsylvania. And my roommate was this black kid from DC. And he was from DC, like he lived in poverty and he came, and I was scared. Like I was
Yeah.
16 years old. And then he started talking about these things that, like, he was like this big nerd, which I was too.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait,
Yeah.
ready for this? This is what like blew my mind when I thought, I'm like, wait, black kids are interested in something other than like basketball and drugs and guns.
Yes.
I swear that, and I'm like,
Yeah.
man, so what I inherited, the thing that was like poured into me, was this stereotype that not skin color, but a particular kind of black person was less than human. Like that they weren't capable of being interested in science, technology, the Bible, you name it, toys. It is so gross and infectious. And that un, unchallenged is what you experienced in your church and adults who never really were confronted with, well, hold on a second, this person is a human being.
Yep.
you know
Yep. And
yeah.
that's what I do in training, actually. The
Mm,
second day of training, if I'm with a group, I do at least 3 sessions with the group. So I don't do one-offs anymore. But the second day of training, I will call out each racial category and tell people, I need you to take 25 seconds to write down every word or phrase that you've heard or seen about this particular group of people.
mm.
I'm not asking you what you believe, but what have you heard and seen?
Yeah, that's good.
And I tell, then we get to white, and I say, you're not going to write about white though. I just want you to write it, because white is everywhere. You are immersed in white. You got everything to say about whiteness. But
Yes.
I want you to write down. Now I want you to go back and read that list. And I want you to think about, if I were a 10-year-old Black boy reading your list, what would I think about myself?
That's so good.
And it just causes people, and you can see the discomfort in people. And I'm like, if you're not feeling uncomfortable right now, I need to check your pulse.
Yeah, right.
Because there's power in narratives, right? and
Yes.
and we, particularly those of us that were born, I tell people 40 and under may be a different story, but 40 and older, if there was a Black person in a movie, they were dying first, they were the bad guy, right? There are
Yes.
particular narratives about us that have been true. Must be a basketball player, must be a rapper, can't be smart. And
Yep.
I mean, again, I am all the things that people like. I'm a basketball player, and I'm smart, and I play music, and our whole family is that. Like, my husband is that way, my kids
Mm,
are that way. We are a walking disruption of narratives,
mm.
which I think is so important, because I think every Black kid, every Asian kid should be able to be anything, just like white kids can. White kids can be anything. They can be nerds, jocks, thugs, they can be anything. We don't get that privilege to be anything. We are
Mm,
lumped. And as you know, in school, we do this to children, right? Like, we see children And we already have a story about them. If you're an Asian kid, you should be smart. You should work hard. You should be good at math naturally. If
Yeah.
you're a black kid, we don't, go score a bunch of points on the basketball court, but we're not really going to have high expectations for you around. And I saw this, and it's one of the reasons I became a teacher,
Yeah.
because I saw that dynamic at work when I was in college in Philadelphia. I said, "Oh my gosh, no wonder black kids aren't engaging in school, because we have such small expectations for them, and we don't expect them to do well, so they don't."
Oh, there's so much in that. It's so true. And I feel like what you talked to one of your TikToks that I saw was about identity politics and how whiteness has been centered. You're talking a little bit about this here. It's when the assumption is whiteness, you have to specify. You have to focus in on saying, well, Asian American, Black
Yep,
American, African American. You have to do these things in order to raise awareness that it's not centered, not everything is centered in whiteness
yep,
and whatever flows from that. It's a hard
yep,
lesson for white people to learn.
yep,
But it is, I see it as an infection within us.
yeah,
It's something that requires some kind of surgical removal. And I think you're right. Like the word is disruption. There's got to be some disruption, or else you just go on. And what we see today is all of this fear around anyone that is a person of
yep,
color. You wonder, are they going to be one of those ones that talk about
yep,
welcoming immigrants or Black Lives Matter or something? You know, it is,
yeah.
you're,
Well, and
yeah,
and
go ahead.
I'll just offer it back to your point about what's centered. It also, especially for white men, you can tell me I could be really wrong on this, but I don't think I am, because I get to be around a lot of white men.
Yeah.
I feel like white men are threatened by this because it feels like we're taking something away from them.
Mm-hmm.
And like I had to tell my 78-year-old dad, we're not taking anything. You're just not in the spotlight right now.
Right.
So we're not asking you to leave the room. We're just asking to share the spotlight. And that may feel like oppression to you because you've been in the spotlight the whole time.
Right. Yes.
But this is also harming white people.
Yes.
The way that we talk about this stuff is not just doing harm to black and brown people, it is harming white people.
Yeah.
And, for church folks, this is harming our witness as Jesus people.
Oh, I mean, yes, you're right. Um, the fear is, well, I mean, whether spoken or unspoken,
Yeah.
the felt fear is you're taking everything away from me. I think generally, I think the church that we know, the evangelical church, that witness is gone. I think that there's just no, I don't think that there is a resurrection for that church in America. It has become so overcome by whiteness and nationalism that it's the empire, it's not the kingdom. And when you want, like, there are people within it though that are kingdom people, right? It's
Yes.
just that it's hard to, I think the institution of it is what it is. And you're always going to have to make these bush churches or online spaces where you really experience what I think, we both are captivated by in that Jesus
Yeah.
story. I think you're going to have alternative spaces that really get there.
It's I'm gonna give you a parallel here because you talked about empire versus kingdom, and give you an analogy that I think a lot of people will resonate with right now.
Mm.
So when the Queen died 2 weeks ago,
Yeah.
I talked in a lot of spaces. I happened to be doing training all day that day, so lots of opportunity to talk about it. I've met a queen. So the Queen of the Netherlands. Right now, there's a king. He and I were in high school at the same time.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know him, but he and I were in Model United Nations together, and he was known for being a playboy and smoking a lot and drinking a lot. So
Amazing.
imagine, like, my 16-year-old self knew that he was a playboy,
Yeah.
and oh my gosh, he's going to be king someday. What? But I got to meet the Queen. So she
Wow.
came to our school. I actually had to speak in front of her in her court twice, my junior year once and my senior year once, because I was the president of the Security Council of the largest Model United Nations in the world at the time.
Wow.
So, really nice woman, super gracious, really classy, very kind. And still the head of a monarchy that did incredible harm around the world.
Yes. There. Yeah.
Incredible, unspeakable harm around the world. And so I can say it was incredible to meet her, and she was really kind and gracious and humble.
Mm.
And her station, the monarchy, that institution, is problematic from its inception.
Yes.
And so, I mean, just to your point about the white evangelical church,
Yeah.
I see that as really similar to the monarchy as an institution, as a structure.
Yes.
So there can be good people in it that are kind and gentle and whatever, but the system itself is problematic. And if you're
Yeah.
not speaking up against it, even as a good person, you're complicit.